Hello and welcome to Clock Spinning, podcast of Magic's history as told card by card through Cube. I'm Connor, and with me as always is Austin. How are you doing, Austin?
I'm doing good. I discovered a new nursery in town, and I spent way too much money on indoor plants and fun pots to hold them in, so I'm feeling really good about adding more plants to my office.
Oh, that's wonderful. So a plant nursery, not a children nursery.
No, it was a children's nursery, but they had a good selection of plants too.
Okay. That's where I get most of mine. So today we are doing our first micro episode. We're planning to kind of sprinkle in these smaller, sort of easier to record, easily digestible episodes, along with our mega 3+ hour card reviews.
Yeah, I think we can call those our trademark mega 3+ hour episodes, right?
I think, yeah, we're working on that. So today is our first one of these little special micro or maybe mini episode, depending how long it ends up being. Today we're talking about Zuberas. So we've alluded to these guys a little bit in our first two set review episodes in white and blue. The Zuberas are a cycle of spirits, Zubera spirits, that appear in Champions of Kamigawa and also Saviors, actually. And these are special little spirits that have this wonderful death trigger effect that is amplified depending on how many Zuberas have died in a single turn. So why are we doing this little special episode about Zuberas? Well, Champions has a built-in OTK combo, one-turn kill combo, in the form of these Zuberas paired with the card Devouring Greed. So we'll talk about what all these cards do in just a little bit, but we wanted to kind of highlight this OTK combo, highlight the Zuberas a little bit, mostly because I really love them, and I've tried several times to build a deck that works with the Zuberas and that works with this OTK. So we just wanted to highlight this in a little mini episode and talk about these cards at their full glory.
I think it's fair to call these some of your pet cards, right? 2 or 3 times I've seen you building a deck to try to put all this together. And it is a tough thing to put together, especially with the tools back then, like the mana in a constructed deck where you really need to run all 20 Zuberas across 5 colors. The mana is pretty tough to make work.
It is very difficult, yeah.
Be easier today with, the various tribal lands that let you choose a creature type and then tap for any color in order to cast them, but we didn't have any of that technology back in 04.
Yeah, and it's kind of rough that, this combo appeared in a set that really was anything but multicolor oriented.
Yeah, right.
For this whole combo to really work and for even the Zuberas individually to work at their full potential, you need to be in multiple colors, preferably all 5 in my opinion, but it's tough to pull off just in this block.
That's a great point. This really is one of the least multicolor friendly blocks in, I think, all of Magic. Just in terms of the mana that's available to you and the cards. There's very few cards that push you into multiple colors either.
In fact, there are only 2 gold cards in the whole set. So look forward to that in a future episode. So we'll also be rating all of the Zuberas in today's episode. We kind of, went back and forth a little bit on the first 2 episodes about, should we rate the Zuberas independently? Should we rate them all together as a build-around package? And we've decided we're just going to go through and rate all of them as a group in today's episode. Just to tell you a little bit more about what the Zuberas actually do before we get too much further into how this combo works and why we're talking about these cards. The basic structure or mechanic of the Zuberas is they are all 2-mana spirits. They all have 1/2 power toughness, and they all have an effect that is something along the lines of when this Zubera is put into a graveyard from play, when it dies, trigger X effect a number of times for each Zubera put into a graveyard from play this turn. So what this means is if you get a whole bunch of Zuberas dying all together on the same turn, each of them is having this effect trigger and you're getting a massive amount of value, at least by Kamigawa standards.
And so if they all die at the same time, for example, through Devouring Greed, I believe they all see each other simultaneously. So let's say you have 4 Emberfist Zuberas, just to make it easy. They all die at once. So what happens is all 4 of them die. They all go to the graveyard. All of their abilities go on the stack. And so each of them will see that 4 Zuberas died this turn. And so if 4 Emberfist Zuberas die all in the same turn, all of them will deal 4 damage to any target, which for a death trigger on a measly 2-drop is pretty darn good. It's just the trick is having them all die at the same time.
Exactly. So this is actually a good time to talk about what each Zubera's death trigger is and what they do. So there's 5 Zuberas, 1 in each color in Champions. The white one is called Silent Chant Zubera. When it dies, you gain 2 life for each dead Zubera. Floating Dream is the blue one, and that draws you a card. Ashen Skin Zubera is the black one. That forces your opponent to discard a card. Ember Fist, as Austin just mentioned, deals 1 damage for each Zubera that dies. And Dripping Tongue, the green one, gives you a little 1/1 colorless spirit baby. So this effect, according to Mark Rosewater, is based on a very old card from Legends called Blazing Effigy. And what Blazing Effigy does, I'm not going to read the card text word for word from back in 1994 because it's a little bit messy. But Blazing Effigy is basically a 0/3 2-drop. When it dies, it deals 3 damage to a target creature. And if you use that 3 damage from the dying effigy to kill another effigy, then the second effigy that dies deals 3 damage plus however much damage it has taken from effigies that turn.
They're very strange.
Very strange card. I guess the idea here is that you use one effigy to kill another, use that second one to kill another one, and you stack up, 3 damage over and over and over again, and then send all this damage at a creature. And that's the problem with this card.
Yeah, that's it's such a missed opportunity, isn't it? Because the otherwise it would be a really, I don't know if it'd even actually be a really cool and interesting card, but it would have been a moderately cool and interesting card. But the fact that it could only point at creatures feels like such a miss, because it can never have much of an impact. But if it's enough to birth the Zuberas, then it was a worthy card.
It's good enough for me. I misread Blazing Effigy at first. I thought you could deal the damage to a creature or a player. And I was like, wow, it seems like it should do that.
It just seems like it should work.
But there's no Blazing Effigy OTK, at least not an obvious one that I can see.
Maybe with like Stuffy Doll, but you'd have to break the normal 4X. It's really hard to conceive of a scenario in which Blazing Effigy is worth the work.
Was there a 4-card limit back in Legends? Probably not, right?
There wasn't for Alpha, and I'm trying to remember when it was introduced. I'm not sure if it existed by the time Legends came around, but even then, at the time, I don't think there wasn't a Stuffy Doll type effect that I know of that could redirect damage from a creature to a player. Now I'm doubting myself. I feel like probably someone is going to write in and say there was some random aura in Antiquities or something that did that. And if there was, let us know.
We would like to know about the Blazing Effigy OTK.
As a little historical aside, before we get into rating the Zuberas in depth and talking about how they fit into the cube and how they might fit into your cube or not, this inspired me to do a little Scryfall deep dive to see how many creatures actually have death triggers in Magic versus how many creatures have enter the battlefield triggers in Magic. What I found is that, as you might suspect, there's a lot more ETB triggers than death triggers. So there are almost 2,000 creatures in the history of Magic, 1,978 with enter the battlefield triggers. There's a mere 384 with death triggers. So that's like a 5-to-1 ratio. Interestingly, in Kamigawa, there's a lot more death triggers relative to ETB triggers. So in all of Kamigawa, there's only 13 creatures that have an ETB trigger versus 17 death triggers. So the Zubera, the dragons, the 2 other bad Zubera we're going to talk about, and then a handful of others. Although even there, that's a little deceptive because Kamigawa has this trademark Spiritcraft mechanic that isn't named but shows up in a bunch of cards when a creature or when a spirit enters the battlefield or a arcane spell is cast. So even in Kamigawa, it's a little distorted. But anyway, I just thought it was interesting that typically you see many, many more ETB triggers than death triggers, but in Kamigawa, not so much.
That is kind of unusual. And we've sort of referenced this a little bit in the first couple of episodes, that there just are not, we were seeing these cards that would sort of let you bounce spirits back to your hand, or that white card, Hikari Twilight Guardian, these effects that sort of seem to suggest that there's going to be some sort of enter the battlefield type effect that you're trying to pull off.
Yeah, Otherworldly Journey.
Yeah. And there's just not that much of it.
In modern Magic, basically half of all creatures have enter the battlefield triggers stapled to them in order to, basically to prevent feel bads where a creature enters and gets no value. And, modern Magic is so tempo driven, so driven by who can produce the most value per card. It really is alien reading Kamigawa spoilers and seeing almost every card kind of requires you to put some work into it in order to get something back out in a way that just isn't true of modern Magic design.
Right.
For good or for ill.
And probably a lot more feel bad moments where, you're just
yes.
not getting any value out of the card, or not nearly as much as you'd hope to.
Mm-hmm.
One card that you are going to get a lot of value out of in this beautiful combo is Devouring Greed.
Oh, yeah.
So this is kind of the centerpiece of this Zubera OTK, and I'll go ahead and tell you what it does. Devouring Greed is a black sorcery from Champions. Costs 2 BB to cast. Oh, and I should mention it's arcane as well.
Ooh.
When you cast Devouring Greed, you can sacrifice any number of spirits, which the Zuberas are, of course. And target player loses 2 life plus 2 life for each spirit sacrificed this way, and you gain that much life. So Devouring Greed can create a huge life swing between you and your opponent if you have enough spirits to sacrifice. And the idea, of course, with the Zuberas, as you probably figured out by now, is to get as many of them as you can out on the battlefield, sacrifice them all to Devouring Greed, and then kill your opponent in one turn, ideally by having a lot of Ember Fist Zuberas that are going to stack up a lot of damage for all these Zuberas that are dying.
It's just so much value.
So much value, so much life for you, so much lost life for your opponent. And that is the combo, basically. Devouring Greed is also just a great card on its own, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more in the next episode, I think, when we do our sort of full review of all the black cards of Champions of Kamigawa. It has a special place for me paired with the Zuberas because I tried so hard back in the day, and more recently too, to build a Zubera deck that actually worked with Devouring Greed. There are some kind of interesting popper Zubera decks out there that you can see now that do not use Devouring Greed. They kind of rely more on, what's the word I'm looking for, sort of smaller scale sacrifice effects. Some of these decks have Viscera Seer in them, to get some scry value. And basically the idea there with these decks is to just kind of let you sacrifice these Zuberas at will, which is also a cool idea. But there's just something about this hope of mine to set up a field with a whole bunch of Zuberas on it, sack them all to Devouring Greed, and then just take your opponent from 20 to 0 instantly.
Yeah, and the nice thing about the other Zuberas alongside Ember Fist is they do leave residual value behind, right? So like Floating Dream Zubera lets you draw more cards in order to set up if you just need a little more finishing damage. Silent Chant, even as lame as he is gaining life, that's enough to kind of stonewall your opponent. Dripping Tongue leaves behind some blockers or attackers. So they do all play nicely with the central card.
Yeah, for sure. There are also some different cards you could use to fill out this deck. Obviously, there are many throughout Magic's history that would let you sacrifice these spirits in various ways, but some of the other kind of possible cards that you could throw into this deck, because having 20 Zuberas and 4 Devouring Greeds is obviously not going to give you a full deck. So some other cards that I was kind of thinking about and looking at just within Kamigawa block are Eerie Procession, which we talked about last episode. Blue spell, which lets you search your deck for an arcane spell. You would use this to find the Devouring Greed.
Incidentally, since last episode, I think Eerie Procession has gone up just a little bit in both of our estimations. We'll talk more about the Dampen Thought archetype and the kind of general stall them out blue-white arcane spells archetype in the mailbag segment in a bit. But I think we're realizing Eerie Procession has just a few more uses than we initially thought.
Yeah, I'm probably a little too fixated on just getting Devouring Greed.
That's really how I sold the concept of the show to you, was just,
we're going to talk about Zuberas.
There's going to be Zuberas in it, and you said, I'm in.
Austin promised me a full episode about Zuberas, and that's where this all came from. So there's also kinds of blue card draw that we've talked about that would get more of these Zuberas so you can get them out there. There's a card in red called Devouring Rage, which is similar to Devouring Greed. But what Rage does, it's an instant instead of a sorcery. It also lets you sacrifice a bunch of spirits, but instead of causing your opponent to lose life and giving you life, it lets you give one creature +3/+0 for each spirit sacrifice.
+3/+0, and notably not trample.
Not trample, not flying, nothing like no kind of evasion, nothing to get the damage through. But in theory,
if
it gave trample, it'd be
pretty viable, I think, as a secondary kind of a backup Devouring Greed, really.
And maybe even viable just on its own.
Just as a card.
Just as a card, yeah.
Yeah.
So the lack of trample is a bummer, but if you can just sneak one Zubera in there and then sacrifice the rest of the board,
Or like a Lantern Kami, you have, because it is an instant, right? Devouring Rage is an instant. Yeah. So send in your little flyer. They're all unsuspecting. Boom!
Very sneaky.
Got them. And actually, the damage ceiling is higher on Devouring Rage, right? Because it's +3. It's 3 as a base, and then 3 for each. So if you sack 4, that's like 15. Pretty good.
Yeah. Boom. What else do we got here? He Who Hungers is a black legendary spirit that lets you sacrifice other spirits.
With an amazing name.
Great name. One of the best names in this set, I think. But He Who Hungers, he lets you sacrifice a lot of Zuberas with an activated ability that he has. So there's that. I mentioned Life Spinner in here. I'm not sure if this would be worth having, but you could.
You're digging deep at this point.
I'm really digging deep to try to make this work. I was trying to find just any kind of card that could fill out this deck that would make it possibly viable. Life Spinner is probably not that card.
Do you want to read Life Spinner for the hand? I'm sure most of our listeners have memorized Life Spinner.
Yeah,
but
I'm
there
sure
might be
everyone's
a few...
very familiar with Life Spinner, but let me pull it up here. So Life Spinner is a 3G for a 3/3 spirit. You can tap him and sacrifice 3 spirits to search your library for a legendary spirit card and put it into play. So that you're getting double value off Life Spinner with Zuberas because you can sacrifice 3 of them, maybe 3 Floating Dream Zuberas, draw 9 cards, and search your library for that legendary spirit, in this case, He Who Hungers.
We're not rating Life Spinner this episode, and yet I wish we were, because now my mind is just spinning thinking about this hill giant that does something very nifty.
Yeah, unfortunately, we'll be waiting a while for him because he's in green and Betrayers, so... yeah, painful.
We've got Soul Blast, which I think is maybe the next to Devouring Greed, the most effective one. So Soul Blast is 3 RRR, so 6 mana, 3 designated red, instant. As an additional cost to cast this, sack all creatures you control. Deals damage to any target equal to the total power of the sacked creatures. That would be great. I think the triple designated is kind of a deal breaker, but the fact it boosts the damage is really nice.
Yeah.
I guess I forgot that Devouring Greed still gives you a better rate because these guys have 1 power. Maybe Soul Blast isn't good in this. Disregard.
The triple designated is a bit of a bummer too in a deck that theoretically is 5 colors.
It's tough.
One last guy I wanted to throw in there was Shimatsu the Bloodcloaked. Also a great name.
Some freaky, scary art too.
It really is. And a demon, which we haven't had a chance to get to yet in the set, but we will very soon.
Ooh, that'll be fun to talk about.
So as Shimatsu comes into play, you can sacrifice any number of permanents, and he comes into play with that many +1/+1 counters. So this would basically just be an easy way to sack a whole bunch of Zuberas.
And you could get a 5/5 out of it, so you know.
Yeah, and you might get a 5/5.
Oh, and you can sack your lands. That's cute. So he could be like a 6/6 before he eats a Ren Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Be cool.
Mm-hmm. Some Kamigawa value. So those are just some potential cards that could fill out a Zubera style deck.
Connor?
Yeah.
Are you ready to reveal the big twist?
I think I am. There are 2 more Zuberas in Saviors.
Which I did not know until we started researching this podcast. I had completely missed this, even as a Zubera fan.
I didn't know this either until I started making Zubera decks and just, Googled Zubera. And then I saw these 2 guys and I'm like, who are they? There's 2 more Zuberas in Saviors, not 5 more. Remember, the Zubera is a 5-color cycle in Champions. But they decided to just throw in 2 more Zuberas in Saviors, 1 blue one and 1 red one. And mechanically, these are completely different from the Zuberas that all of you now know and love.
They're really bizarre.
They are. So we've got... Do you want to read them to us?
First up, Rushing Tide Zubera. 2 UU for a 3/3 Zubera Spirit. When it dies, if 4 or more damage was dealt to it this turn, draw 3 cards. So it's a 3/3, and if it gets dealt 4 or more damage while dying, you draw 3. And Burning Eye Zubera is very much the same card. 2 RR, 3/3 Zubera Spirit. If 4 or more damage is dealt to it, it deals 3 damage to any target. So basically, one of them Ancestrals and the other one Lightning Bolts, which seems a little asymmetrical, but that's fine. I guess they're both the best of the original Boon Cycle from Alpha, so that's fine. Really, really strange design on these. They ask you to put a really large amount of work in a way that you... They're so different from the original Zuberas, because I feel like as medium as the original Zuberas are, you at least can control whether they trigger more, whereas these, you're kind of dependent on your opponent to trigger them. Or if you're not, you're probably wasting cards to trigger them. Pretty high value cards to deal 4 damage. So these 2 are real oddballs.
The original Zuberas, you're always going to get some kind of value out of them. Their trigger happens when they die. You may not get all the Zuberas dying that you want to, but you're going to get something out of it. These guys, if you don't create this trigger, if you don't deal 4 or more damage to them one way or another, then they do nothing. They're just 4 mana 3/3, which isn't terrible in Kamigawa, but it's not exciting.
It's not great even there. And yeah, the challenge is I think that's largely your opponent's call. Like, obviously they choose what they block with.
Right.
So don't block it with a 4-power creature. And then on defense, you have some input, but they can still just choose what they swing in with and when. So it's just really hard to see how you set either of these cards up. And without that, they are hill giants with 2 designated mana and their mana cost, which is tough.
I'm extra frustrated about Burning Eye Zubera, not only because it doesn't have the Ancestral Recall attached to it, like Rushing Tide does, but with
Hmm.
Burning Eye Zubera, if you're trying to set something up where you're creating some effect where you kill your own Zuberas and,
Right.
trigger it, think about Burning Eye Zubera. You have to pour 4 damage into it to deal 3 damage to target
Right.
creature or player.
Right.
If you were the controller of the damage coming in, you would just want to send it at someone else, not your own creature.
Unless it was with Burning Effigy, Connor, in which case this could allow you to deal the 3 you could have dealt with Burning Effigy to a player, actually to a player, or Blazing Effigy.
Okay, yeah. No, but you would need two blazing effigies,
No, because they deal 3, so you could kill your Blazing Effigy.
but you need to deal 4.
Oh no. Oh, you're
Go
right.
ahead. Yeah,
Oh boy.
yeah.
So you could you could sack one Blazing Effigy to kill another Blazing Effigy, to kill Burning Eye Zubera, to dome your opponent for 3.
That's value right there.
That's a lot of value.
I mean, you're 8 mana, 3 damage. Sounds good to me.
When we roll out our custom format that is just legends and 4 drops from Kamigawa block, and that's the whole format, I think this could have some legs.
Stay tuned for next season, folks.
We'll do a special season just on that.
So I've just about had enough of these two guys, but one last thing, it is kind of interesting that they are mechanically closer to the original Effigy. Their trigger relies on them taking damage instead of just dying, which is how that original Blazing Effigy worked. But yeah, they feel like knockoff Zuberas to me, and it's disappointing that they don't have the same effect as the original cycle. They're only in 2 colors for some reason. They don't have the same, 2 mana 1/2 ratio that the originals do. So I wonder why they were in here at all.
Yeah, knockoff is a good way to put it, because they really do feel like you're walking down an alleyway and someone goes, "Hey, I got a Zubera. You interested?" That's totally legit. It's an official Zubera. Like they just they really do
and you
feel
you
lame.
can't remember what the names of the actual Zuberas are. You're like, "Oh yeah, I've been looking for some Ember Fist Zuberas," but he goes, "Hey, I got some Burning Eye Zuberas," and you go, "Oh,
Yeah, that sounds
was
right.
that it? That seems about right."
Yeah, and it does some when it dies, right? He's like, "Yeah, I got you, pal." So Connor, can this one turn kill, before we get into rating each of the Zuberas, like what do you think of this one turn kill? Is this, you've had a lot of experience in your life trying to make this work. What do you think?
I think it probably cannot work in our cube. The idea of having a deck that is in more than 2 colors, or that does anything more than splash into a third color, I think is going to be very difficult in a Kamigawa cube, just because there is so little fixing.
Yeah, although we talked about, when we get to our mana episode, we're strongly considering dipping outside of Kamigawa block for the fixing, because there just isn't any in the original Kamigawa.
Right. So we may need to do that, but we're probably not going to do it just to get this OTK to work. I think realistically, you need to be, if you were to pull this off, you need to be in 4 colors for this to work. You need blue for the card draw, possibly for Eerie Procession, for the Floating Dream Zuberas to be able to draw enough cards to find everything you need. You need to be in black for Devouring Greed. You need to be in red for the Ember Fist Zuberas, which give you that extra damage on top of Devouring Greed that you need to pull off the OTK. And I think you also need to be in green, mostly for Kodama's Reach and maybe Sakura Tribe Elder, to get the little bit of fixing that there is in this set.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of the best soul shift creatures like Forked Branch Garami also sit in green, which are nice with the Zubera.
That's true. I really hope that at some point we'll be able to pull this off in the cube, and we're about to go through and kind of rate the Zuberas individually. So it's possible you could put this together, but I don't think that we should view them as sad as this makes me. I don't think we should view them as sort of a big build around package that live or die together.
I agree. I think the good news is that many of them are pretty okay on their own, and Devouring Greed is certainly okay on its own. And so I think we can allow you and other drafters to chase the dream without, just cluttering the cube with otherwise unplayable cards. I don't think they're great well, I think 1 or 2 of them are actually genuinely quite solid, but they're not embarrassing either. None of them are totally embarrassing.
So should we go ahead and go through and just rate all 7 of these Zubera? We'll skip ahead a little bit to Saviors to rate those 2 knockoff Zuberas. Okay, let's kick it off with Silent Chant Zubera.
Yeah, so I have Silent Chant probably as an insta-cut. I think it's the weakest of the 5 OG Zuberas on trigger. Gaining 2 life isn't terrible. If you can trigger multiple of them, it's actually not bad, but it's definitely it's the only one that doesn't have any kind of card advantage or board impact when it dies.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also, as you were saying, the only color that you don't need in this deck really is white. Otherwise, like white doesn't bring that many Spirit Craft triggers. It doesn't really bring Soul Shift to the party. There's not a lot of reason to run white on its own. It doesn't really support what the rest of the deck is trying to do very much either.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm a little bit more favorable toward Silent Chan, and not only because it's a Zubera.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the 2 life gain could potentially matter in a format that we think is going to be as grindy as this probably will be. Being able to get a couple life, potentially amplifying that even more if you happen to have multiple Zubera out, could matter. We really loved Candle's Glow. The idea of Candle's Glow is, stall out card based on the life gain that it can give you. I think there's like just enough value to Silent Chant being a spirit, being a 2-mana 1/2, which can trade with a surprising number of things in Kamigawa. There are so many creatures that have just 1 toughness for some reason, and getting that little bit of life, I feel like it's a meh.
It's a bold call trying to raise this guy all the way to meh. I'm fine including
a bold meh,
including 1 or 2 of them to start. I feel like it's 2. I feel like all of these, including one of them, is just weird. It just sends a false signal.
Yeah.
I do think it's the least likely the 5 to make the grade in the long run.
I think that's probably right. Should we say 2 at meh for now?
Yeah, that works.
All right.
Okay, next up we have Floating Dream. As a reminder, this is the blue one, and you draw cards when it dies for each Zubera. I think this is probably the best of the 5. It essentially always replaces itself. If you get 2, then it double replaces itself. So if 2 blue die in the same turn, for example, you're drawing 4 cards. It also helps support what the blue deck is trying to do natively, which is to say stall out until you could start either overwhelming with Dampen Thought or the foggy effects, or go over the top with Spiritcraft triggers. So I think this one is the best of them. Maybe the only one I'd pull all the way up to playable. Yeah, I'd say it's playable, actually.
I'm not sure if I would say that I think it's the best one, but I do think it's very solid just on its own. Blue does not have a lot of great creatures, as we saw in our last episode. And I think just like a 2-mana 1/2 that replaces itself is enough on its own, with the possibility of extra value.
I was thinking 3 of these things just because I like the way it supports the rest of what blue does.
Yeah, I think that's kind of right.
All right. Are you willing to go to playable, or do you feel like it's more of a meh?
I was saying meh at first, and I think that's actually what we said in the last episode, but I think you're right that it's playable. And I'm going to call a few other Zuberas playable later, so I don't think that's too generous.
All right. You want to talk to us about Ashen Skin?
Ashen Skin Zubera is the black Zubera. Just as a reminder, he causes your opponent to discard a card for each Zubera that's died. I think this is probably the worst Zubera.
Wow, worse than Silent Chant?
Okay. The problem is, for me with Ashen Skin, is I think I tend to overrate discard effect. Like, it always seemed from the moment we started playing Magic, I felt like discard is, very powerful, very frustrating for your opponent. You're keeping them from playing something that they have been holding for a long time, maybe, or you're denying them a land that they really need. But the fact that Ashen Skin probably comes into the game pretty early when your opponent still has a large hand and you have no control over what they discard, I think makes him kind of limited value.
I'm inclined to agree. I also feel like discard effects where your opponent chooses what to discard are usually less good than they appear. You think of like Mind Rot, and Mind Rot's fine. We're going to talk about a Mind Rot card, I believe, in the next episode, but it's never great. You contrast this with like Ravenous Rats, right? The classic, 1 black, when it ETBs, target opponent discards a card. And that card also never impresses while being an ETB trigger. So it's much more likely to be relevant. Yeah, I agree. By the time this thing dies, there's a decent chance it's just not going to do anything. Although I do think the nature, when we've been doing test drafts, it's pretty rare for players to really empty their hand in this format. It's just so slow, and there's a fair amount of card draw and recursion effects. So I do think its value is a little higher than it would be in most formats.
Yeah, that's fair. That said, like, the fact that this is a death trigger instead of a ETB type effect, that does give your opponent even more control over it. So if they're really scared of that discard, they can try to play things out of their hand as much as possible before they kill the Ashen Skin. It's hard to see the situation where they're going to be that terrified of this 2-mana 1/2. Like, a lot of discard effects are, a sorcery that will force your opponent to discard, and that they can't really see it coming. But with Ashen Skin, like he's sitting there, they know the discards come in at some point and they have some power over when that happens.
This is also the one that benefits least, I would say, from the fact that you can get triggers that increase in importance or impact the more Zubera die.
Right.
Discarding 2 cards is definitely better than 1. 3 is definitely better than 2, say, but like 6 isn't meaningfully different than 3. It doesn't really have as much of a cascading effect as the other Zubera do.
That's a really good point. I think unlike all 4 other Zuberas, really, there's like a hard cap to the value that you can get out of Ashen Skin, which is your opponent's hand size. They only have 2 cards in their hand. You're not going to get that much value out of forcing them to discard 4, whereas every other Zubera, there's kind of no limit to how much they can do for you, how powerful they can be.
Yeah, although admittedly, if you're stripping your opponent's hand, that always is a good feeling. Maybe I'm over-rotating on that.
Sounds like we should probably settle around meh on this guy.
Yeah, I think the fact that he happens to be in the same color as Devouring Greed spares him from like the Executioner's Axe, which I otherwise might give him, to be honest.
And actually, aside from the Devouring Greed combo, just being a spirit in black, which does have a lot of soul shift, does, I think, have more value out of getting spirits and having spirits die, bringing spirits back. I think that bumps him up just a little bit too.
Yeah, we haven't talked about the art for each of these, and I don't think we have to, but this one, for my money, has the best art of the
You
5.
think so?
Oh yeah, I like how creepy it is. I like that it's fairly dynamic pose. I don't know, I just think it looks really cool.
Yeah, he does look like a real creeper in this art.
Yeah. Who's your favorite art, just as an aside?
That's a good question. I actually like Dripping Tongue quite a bit. It's definitely the grossest name, but who doesn't like a dripping tongue?
Kind of the grossest art for my money.
Yeah.
Big long tongue is freaking me out.
He's sort of this sinewy, viney, humanoid type figure. All the Zuberas are vaguely humanoid, and he's got a real long tongue coming out of his head. It's a little bit like, it reminds me, I don't know why it doesn't look that much like them, but it reminds me of the Demogorgon from Stranger Things.
Where'd you rate this? I have it as kind of a 2x meh.
Yeah, I think that's right.
All right, next up, Ember Fist. Ember Fist is the red one, and it deals 1 damage for each Zubera that died this turn. I have this thing at a meh. I think it looks a little better than it is because the base rate is it dies and deals 1 damage, which, isn't anything that impressive, really. Once 2 of them die, I think dying and shocking is actually pretty solid, but 1 damage isn't really enough to do what I think this often is doing is not killing your opponent. It's like goblin sharpshooting your opponent's board, but with just 1 of them, it's really not doing anything.
I'm going to disagree with you a little bit.
Okay.
I consider Ember Fist playable.
Whoa.
Just pinging for 1 damage is obviously not a big deal most of the time in Magic. But there are so many creatures in Kamigawa specifically that just have 1 toughness. There are a ton of 2 mana 2/1s. There are some cards, like one we'll talk about in the next episode, that are 6 mana 4/1s.
I mean, are those making the grade though?
They may not make the grade, but there are a ton of 1 toughness cards.
You're right. It's 90. There are 97 creatures with 1 toughness in the block.
Yeah, so that's like close to a 1/6 of all the cards in the block.
Yeah, let's see what percentage of all creatures that is. So there are 336. Holy cats. There are 336 creatures in the block, which means 28% of all creatures in the block have 1 toughness. Wow.
Yeah, so Ember Fist, he's trading with one of those 1 toughness creatures, and he's potentially pinging another one.
It makes him into kind of a pseudo bear now that you say. I mean, he's almost a 2/2 because he could ping the thing he was fighting with, and now he's almost a playable card.
He's almost a bear. He can deal with Bushido, kind of. So I think he's playable.
Connor's going to say almost a bear equals playable.
Almost a bear is playable in this set.
Okay, and how many do you want to run?
So I said 3, but I feel like 2 is probably right.
I'm fine with 2. We'll talk about it when we get to red. Red is maybe the weakest color in this set, and I suspect Ember Fist might actually kind of outperform there. But I'm fine leaving him at 2 to start.
Okay, let's do that.
And you want to call it playable?
I do want to call it playable.
All right.
Our final Zubera then, my favorite artistically, is Dripping Tongue. This is the green Zubera. When it dies, you get a 1/1 spirit token for each Zubera that died that turn. I think this is also playable. For similar reasons to Ember Fist, just having another creature on the board, especially another spirit, creates some value. This also triggers. Oh no, I guess it wouldn't trigger it when you play a spirit or arcane spell.
Yeah, Spiritcraft is when you play, right? Not when one enters.
Yeah, when you play, yeah, that's a bummer. I still think this is playable though. It sort of replaces itself.
This is probably the number 2 Zubera for me. I still like Floating Dream best just because it's guaranteed to get. It's not. I mean, I guess they're both guaranteed to get something back, but I just love drawing cards so much.
I know you do.
I can imagine a world in which we end up cutting, the black one entirely, the white one entirely, maybe even Emberfist entirely, but I don't see a scenario in which this one in green, the Spiritcraft color, just gets cut. I think it's always going to be a solid card, especially in like the black green Spiritcraft deck that just happens to pick up one Devouring Greed as a big finisher. This thing, because the great part about this is you could sack it or you could sack the thing that's left behind. So it's really nice with Devouring Greed.
Right. If you have 2 Devouring Greeds, you can also use the second one to sack all the little Zubera babies that are left behind by Dripping Tongue.
I don't like calling them babies. That makes me feel kind of bad, but
so they're Zubera babies, so it's fine.
Yeah, I'm willing to call this one playable actually, and I think
all
3 of them feels good to me.
I think so. I think we need to be generous to Dripping Tongue and Floating Dream, our respective favorite Zuberas.
All right, we're going to do a little bit of favoritism.
Yeah.
Okay, I think the next 2 may not get as much favoritism though.
Definitely not.
Okay, so we're jumping to the Saviors Zuberas with Rushing Tide Zubera. So as a reminder, 2 UU, 3/3 Zubera Spirit. When it dies, if 4 damage was dealt to it this turn, 4 more damage was dealt to it this turn, draw 3 cards. I just have this as an insta-cut. I don't like that these make me think of the other Zuberas when I look at them. Like, I almost can't evaluate them fairly. Like, if they were called something like Blue Ancestral Recall Spirit, I think I would be kinder to them. But the fact that they are these weird imitations of the other Zubera just makes me sad.
That is a great name, though.
Blue Ancestral Recall Spirit.
Yeah, I like that a lot better. Especially Rushing Tide, honestly, because the art on this card is very, very similar to Floating Dream and is obviously meant to evoke Floating Dream Zubera.
It kind of implies this is like the super Floating Dream Zubera.
Yeah, he's evolved and become a lot worse.
Yeah.
I want to insta-cut this.
All right, we're leaping ahead in time to insta-cut Rushing Tide Zubera. This is kind of an exciting moment.
It is. We're sort of breaking the rules here.
Yeah, we're time traveling.
So let's do it again with Burning Eye Zubera, which is the red version, 2 RR for 3/3 Zubera Spirit. If it is dealt 4 or more damage, then deal 3 damage to target creature or player. A lot of value there.
The 4 versus 3 is just like salt in the wound every time.
It really is. Yeah, this is an insta-cut for me.
I mean, the Rushing Tide, at least you feel like you get an Ancestral at the end. It's not that Lightning Bolt is bad. Lightning Bolt is great. But it doesn't have the same kind of magnetic attraction as draw 3 cards.
With both of these, there just are not that many big creatures in this block.
Yeah.
Like, there's not that many things that are going to deal 4 or more damage to these Zuberas. Even if I could set aside the fact that they're knockoff Zuberas, which I can't. I don't think they're very good.
Yeah, let's just cut both of these knockoffs.
Get them out. Now that we've talked through all these Zuberas and the place that they have in our cube, do you think that the Zuberas have any place in a non-Kamigawa themed cube?
Maybe, I think is the answer. I think if you're running a lower power cube, particularly a lower power cube with a lot of synergy, I think you could. None of these see very much play. Looking at Cube Cobra, Floating Dream gets the most, appearing in 196 cubes, and it's downhill from there. Dripping Tongue in 179, Ashen Skin in 172, Ember Fist in 157, just 136 for the white one, Silent Chant, and then our Saviors ones get into 103 and 91 cubes, respectively. And I should say all of these numbers are including our cube. A couple of times because we have this cube and a backup version that shows the original. So
we're inflating the numbers a little bit.
We're artificially inflating the numbers. I think you could, but you probably wouldn't, is my answer. I think on their own, Floating Dream and Dripping Tongue, like we talked about, sort of stand apart as cards that would be pretty reasonable to run in most cubes that have a lot of sacrifice synergy. I think the problem with that is they have this weird trigger that's kind of hard to read and understand. And particularly if you're in a traditional singleton cube where you're not running multiples, I think it would just send a really bizarre signal to the drafter. So like Floating Dream, I think in a lot of cubes would be lower power cubes could be okay as like a 2 mana 1/2 that replaces itself on death. But I think the weird trigger is just going to result in strange experiences for your drafters, which is both the attraction of the Zubera and I think also is the reason they see such little play.
Yeah, that's a really good point about creating confusion. Like, I think when you're crafting a cube, you want to be very thoughtful in the cards that are included and think about, what message are they going to be sending as people are drafting? What sort of archetype are they suggesting? What other cards in the cube are they going to go well with? And with our cube, where we're limiting ourselves to this specific block, a lot of those questions kind of answer themselves. But to just drop one of these Zubera into especially a singleton cube, where there's at most maybe one or two other Zuberas that will pop up at all, even if they are okay as a standalone card, I think it does just send a really weird signal to the player that's going to have them looking for more Zuberas and not finding them.
I do think if somehow you're running a unusual low powered cube that allows multiples and has a good amount of graveyard synergy, I think Floating Dream and Dripping Tongue could pretty easily make the grade in that kind of cube, and I think the others are okay-ish. It's just I think apart from Kamigawa block cubes, I suspect there's not a lot of other cubes that meet all these other specific criteria.
Yeah.
All right, I think that takes us to the end of the Zubera segment. Unless, Connor, is there anything else you wanted to cover with these pet cards?
I think I've said all I want to say about them for now, at least.
And to close out today's episode, we just wanted to acknowledge and respond to some of the great feedback we've gotten through Reddit and email and other sources. So yeah, let's just dive in. The first thing is we got a ton of love for Bushi Tenderfoot after the first episode. I don't think I'd realized quite what a pet card this was, but we had multiple people come to the Tenderfoot's defense and point out that while he's a bit hard to flip, there are tools, and it's just so cool and powerful when he does flip.
Yeah, you gotta love that double strike.
Yeah, I think that's great news for you because I feel like you were the big Tenderfoot partisan, and I was kind of like, yeah, man, it's impossible to flip. But I think you're right. We should live the dream.
I really hope we can get this in and flip it because I love this card so much. As a young Magic player, I always wanted to have a samurai deck that worked well, and it seemed like Bushi Tenderfoot and Kenzo needed to be a part of that. There needed to be some way to flip it.
Just the thought that a 1-drop can turn into essentially a 6-power creature is so cool.
It is, and the just flavor of it, of this young inexperienced samurai becoming this hardened warrior. It's just really cool. It was great to see so much love for this.
The other big theme I would say is a lot of love for Dampen Thought. And this is where we confess that we're not complete experts in every part of original Kamigawa block, because it turns out there's a hidden deck in the original Kamigawa block that revolves around using Dampen Thought with a bunch of the foggy, stally effects to mill your opponent out while splicing Dampen Thought onto every one of your foggy game stally effects. Really cool archetype, and it's unusual in that it was discovered kind of halfway through Kamigawa Limited. It was sort of a hidden deck, and we definitely, I think, this raises our opinion of Dampen Thought significantly, and I don't think we're going to end up insta-cutting it.
I remember we were agonizing over this card a little bit because, we both love the mill effect, and it made us sad that there wasn't kind of more milling in the block to pair with this card. But a lot of people raised, some very good points about being able to splice this onto a lot of cards and actually not needing that many copies of Dampen Thought to make this archetype kind of work. And it does sound like a ton of fun to try.
Yeah, we got a lot of comments to this effect, from Dash Hopes and Ender Wiggin and Lads World and all kinds of other people with wonderful usernames. But Lads World in particular pointed us to a great Reddit thread from a few years ago where someone was writing up flashback draft guide for a Triple Champions of Kamigawa MTGO flashback draft. Where they talk about a lot of cards, including Dampen Thought. And then LSV himself jumped into the comments on Reddit to talk about how the Dampen Thought archetype works. And his take is that it's a little easier to assemble than you might think. He feels like you need at most 2 copies to make it work. If you can get more, that's great, but 2 is actually enough to make the deck function. Which makes me think throwing 2 or 3 of these in is actually fine. It's just a little kind of spider spawning style build around.
Yeah, I think so. So we are going to be revising our original Instacut rating for Dampen Thought.
We're just time traveling all over the place this episode.
What do you feel like our renewed rating for Dampen Thought should be?
It's got to be build around, right?
I think so, yeah. Should we say 2 copies or 3?
I think 3, or I was even flirting with 4. Didn't we end up doing something like totally mad and putting in 4 candles glows?
We did put in 4 candles glow, and a few people commented on that as well, and they seem to think it was a pretty solid choice. So maybe we do go with 4 Dampen Thoughts.
I think we should start with 4 and see if A, the deck can ever come together, or B, if it's like, oh wow, this is actually too easy and it should be a little bit harder. I think 4 is a pretty decent starting point.
Yeah, let's try it out.
The other card it's making me think about is Ethereal Haze, which we insta-cut. That's the white fog that's arcane. And I'm wondering if that deck needs 1 or 2 Ethereal Hazes to work out.
That's a good point. Another card to splice the Dampen Thought onto.
Right. I do worry that this deck ends up being a little bit like the Storm deck in the MTGO Vintage Cube, where it's a really cool archetype, it's really unique, and all of its cards are cards no other deck wants, and so you're clogging up a lot of space in the cube with it. But I think we should still put it in and see how it plays.
Yeah.
All right, so we're moving Dampen Thought to a 4x build around and Ethereal Haze to a 2x maybe build around to start.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. And I think whether Ethereal Haze makes kind of the final cut is going to depend a lot on how many arcane spells we end up having, especially in blue, but also in white. It is a good splice candidate for Dampen Thought, but I don't love the idea of, like you said, having more fogs just floating around in the cube doing nothing if you're not going into this Dampen Thought deck.
But yeah, thanks to everybody who challenged us to dig deeper on Dampen Thought. And we'll include a link to that Reddit post where LSV outlines the archetype because it's really a fun read.
Absolutely.
All right, the last set of comments we wanted to call out were from a user called Vivanter. So Vivanter A is building a two-bird cube alongside the main cube that we're building, which I just think is awesome. For anyone who's not familiar, two-bird is a sort of special cube subtype, I suppose you'd say, designed to be played with just 2 players, which seems like a really fun take on this block. But then B, Vivanter took us up on our punning around Council of the Soratami and how easy it is to misread that card, and actually designed a custom Council of the Soratami CONCIL card, which really tickled my fancy.
Yeah, it was a wonderful card. Do you want to read it out for us?
Yes, I do, and we'll link to it from the show notes as well. So Council with an I of the Soratami is 4 and a U for a 2/2 Moonfolk Advisor with flying, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on this, and channel 2 and a U, discard Council of the Soratami, draw 2 cards. I absolutely love this design. I love that it has channel. I love the way it just evokes the original Kamigawa block so strongly. I love the art that was chosen for this. Just a really fun, unique design.
I find it especially great that the channel effect is exactly what the actual Council of the Soratami does to you to draw 2 cards.
Yeah, it's really a wonderful card. How would you rate this? I don't think we're going to put this in the cube. A, because it's not from the block, obviously, but B, for a second reason. But how would you rate this card?
Well, I said in response to Vivanter's post that this would definitely be an auto-include.
Yeah.
If this was a Kamigawa, it's awesome that it gives you this value for drawing all these cards. There's so many cards in blue that let you draw cards, and we were sort of questioning, like, what are you looking for with all this card draw? So this is just some built-in value, but yeah, it would definitely be an auto-include.
Yeah, I actually have it as an OP, I suppose, a new rating, or maybe you would say an Instacut. I think it's almost like Umizawa's Jite. It's obviously not as insanely broken as Jite, but I think actually within the context of the block, this card is probably too good. It's essentially Mulldrifter, right? And Mulldrifter is a very, very solid threat in almost any cube. It can make the grade and do work. And there's just really nothing else in the original Kamigawa that competes with Mulldrifter on flexibility and raw card advantage. So I don't know. I don't know that we could include this card just for power level reasons.
Yeah, you could really run away with the game with this.
But yeah, thank you to Vivanter for that wonderful card. We will link it from the show notes.
I think it's time now for our chant to fall silent.
Oh no.
As this episode turns into a floating dream.
Oh.
Oh. But on next episode, we'll be looking at the black cards of Kamigawa. So we'd like to invite anyone listening now to just take a look at the spoiler and send us your thoughts if there's a black card that you really love from this set. If there's, some thoughts you'd like to share with us before we record that episode, feel free to, shoot us an email, leave a comment on Reddit, and we'd love to highlight those comments as we discuss the cards. If you have any other feedback, any thoughts, memories to share with us about any of the cards or topics that we talked about today, feel free to email us at clockspinningpodcast@gmail.com. So until next time, I'm Connor.
And I'm Austin.
Thanks for listening.